Welcome back from what I hope was a wonderful lunch. It's my real pleasure to introduce session 2 of our weekend's Pan-Orthodoxy in North America toward a local church conference. This session is titled Open Doors, Open Dialogue, Local Church Structures. We have two presenters in this section, Dr. Will Cohen and Dr. Adam DeVille. Our first presenter, Will Cohen, was educated at Brown University, St. Vladimir's Orthodox Theological Seminary, and received his PhD from the Catholic University of America. His doctoral dissertation, The Concept of Sister Churches in Catholic Orthodox Relations Since Vatican II, examines such issues as primacy and conciliarity, the meaning of subsists in, and the mutual recognition of sacraments in the context of schism. He has published articles and reviews in Ecclesiology, Logos, a journal of Eastern Christian Studies, St. Vladimir's Theological Quarterly, and Pro Ecclesia. He is an assistant professor of theology at the University of Scranton, where he lives with his wife and 2 children. Dr. Cohen's talk today is titled, Why Ecclesial Structures at the Regional Level Matter, Communion as Mutual Inclusion.
Just a little note in light of something that Father Radu said this morning. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. About the term local. I'll be using it in my paper to refer generally to the most local, the diocesan level, and we'll use the term regional to refer to the larger ecclesial grouping. So if I were to retitle the symposium, which I'm not, I would call it Towards a Single Regional Communion of Churches. Okay, so I just wanted to mention the terminological issue. In response to a question perhaps a little too crass for his taste, Father Alexander Schmemann is said to have once said, speaking of orthodoxy, "We don't have a theory of apostolic succession, we just have it." Something similar might be said of regional centers of Christian unity. We, the Orthodox, don't have a lot of reflection on regional church structures, we just have them, and always have had. Those who have given more thought to the ecclesiological significance of the regional level turn out to be Roman Catholics. Roman Catholics, one could almost say, don't have regional ecclesial structures, they only have a theology of them. I say almost because, of course, de facto, the Roman Catholic Church does have regional groupings of local churches, even if many Roman Catholics might like them to be given more definition. Their thinking about regional centers of Christian unity has yielded over the past couple of decades a compelling body of work. The aim of my paper is to elucidate some key elements of this theology of communion at the regional level in the shape it's been given by several Catholic writers, and as something that goes to the very heart of the matter of the church, the nature of the church, excuse me. Given that the question of regional ecclesiality is much controverted in Catholic circles and has great ecumenical importance, it will be enough if in what follows the issue can be shown to have some real theological grounding. An insight of the German Catholic theologian Hermann Pottmeyer expresses well the basic thesis. The local church cannot effectively be a local church without the support of the regional communion of local churches. Communion among the churches, he adds, can only succeed if it is regionally organized. The question is why this is so, and I'll try to show that the answer turns on an understanding of communion as mutual inclusion. A second closely related point, a sort of corollary of Pottmeyer's assertion, is that the mission of the churches can succeed only if those churches are regionally organized as well. Here, the case of the Roman Catholic Church in El Salvador, one of the more well-known recent examples of mission and regional organization going together, will be used as an illustration. Although the two dimensions, communion, local churches relating to one another ad intra, and mission, local churches relating to the world ad extra, are finally inseparable, The ad intro side of the question will be taken up in my paper first. So I begin with the section on regional structures and mutual inclusion. The term mutual inclusion is most often used in recent Catholic ecclesiology to speak of the relationship between the local and the universal church. Against an idea put forward in the 1990s by then Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger of the priority of the universal church over the local, a host of Catholic theologians responded by insisting on the simultaneity of the two. A key text for these writers is Lumen Gentium 23, which says of diocesan local churches that, quote, in and from these particular churches, in quibus et ex quibus, there exists the one unique Catholic Church. As Toon van Eyck has written, quote, the in quibus and the ex quibus have to be carefully kept together, allowing one to be able to speak of the relationship between the universal and the local church as a mutual interiority. Cardinal Walter Casper, in his public response to Ratzinger, similarly wrote that, quote, according to the teaching of Vatican II, the local churches and the universal church exist in one another. The discussion becomes much more interesting, however, once the notion of mutual inclusion is used to describe the relationship not just between the local church and the universal church, with the latter considered as a somehow distinct reality of its own, but between each local church and the universal church understood instead as all the local churches in communion. In an important essay on the subject, Joseph Komanczak makes use of several remarks of Pope John Paul II that envision communion between each local church and all the others as mutual inclusion. Where Komanczak first quotes him on this issue, John Paul makes reference to the special Christian experiences which the particular churches are having in the socio-cultural context in which each is called to live. John Paul then points out that these special experiences of particular churches, and here I'm going to quote him at more length, must not be lived in isolation or independently of the lives of the churches in other parts of the world. To constitute authentic experiences of the church, they must in themselves be synthesized with the experiences which other Christians, in touch with different cultural contexts, feel called to live in order to be faithful to the demands that flow from the single and identical mystery of Christ. In fact, among the individual particular churches, there is, he writes, an ontological relationship of mutual inclusion. Every particular church, as a realization of the one Church of Christ, is in some way present in all the particular churches in which and out of which the one and unique Catholic Church has its existence, quoting again Lumen Gentium 23. He concludes, this ontological relation must be translated on the dynamic level of concrete life, if the Christian community does not wish to be in contradiction with itself. The basic ecclesial choices of believers in one community must be able to be harmonized with those of the faithful in the other communities in order to allow for that communion of minds and hearts for which Christ prayed at the Last Supper. Now, where do regional structures come into all this? Well, the process of harmonization that John Paul II alludes to cannot be one that occurs instantly and simultaneously between each diocese and all others throughout the world. Each is not related to all in the same way, or perhaps better to say, not at the same rate. Neighboring dioceses within the same cultural, political milieu will normally become present to one another sooner than will dioceses geographically and culturally distant. Pottmeyer's framing statement quoted earlier, communion among the churches can succeed only if it is regionally organized, may begin to be seen as having an ineluctable logic when viewed in terms of the concept of communion as mutual inclusion. This same language of mutual inclusion is used by Hervé Legrand to challenge what he calls the juridical conception of collegiality in which the universal church is an immediate reality. Legrand writes that to adopt an ecclesiology of communion is to affirm and put into practice a mutual inclusion among local churches. That this requires regional groupings, Legrand indicates when he suggests that collegiality among bishops must be conceived as a coming together of bishops, each presiding over the communion of his local church, and thereby presiding as a group over the communion of the churches of their area. One thus encounters, he concludes, the grouping of regional churches as the unquestionable framework of activity for bishops. The points made briefly thus far would suggest a need to extend or enrich the widely held notion of mutual inclusion of local and universal church. Specifically, it would suggest that the mutual inclusion of each local church and all the others be realized within its regional grouping first, and that only through this mutual inclusion of local and regional can mutual inclusion of local and universal occur. In the 1992 text Communionis Notio issued by the Vatican Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, it is stated that, quote, "For each particular church to be fully church, there must be present in it, as a proper element, the supreme authority of the church, the Episcopal College together with their head, the Supreme Pontiff, and never apart from him. But if, as Legrand says, the unquestionable framework of activity for bishops is the grouping of regional churches, then it may also be said that there must be present in a particular church not only the supreme authority of the church, the Episcopal College together with their head, the Supreme Pontiff, but so too the authority of the church that binds together in diversified unity the regional grouping of churches. This would be the provincial or patriarchal synod, together with their head, the metropolitan or patriarch. In other words, the process of mutual indwelling or mutual inclusion must be understood in such a way that the universal church is formed in and out of the particular churches, not just as so many free-floating interchangeable portions, what Pavel Florensky describes as the chaotic confusion of all with all, but as they exist in their integrated context as members of one another in a closer relation to some than to others, as is the case in any real organism. Okay, part 2 is regional structures with regard to mission. Miriam Winchlands, in her article, The Intermediate Level in the Roman Catholic Church, speaks of the origin of episcopal conferences from the 16th century on up through the 19th in Europe. They are, she writes, in a way, the result of the development of national states, the rise of social movements, and the need felt by the bishops to discuss the new situation with all the bishops of their nation, because they saw that the issues they had to address would require that they had to present themselves as one partner in dialogue with the government, and that they could not enter into such discussions effectively as individual bishops. The 2007 Bouteneff Statement of the Joint International Commission for Theological Dialogue between Catholics and Orthodox likewise draws the connection between the regional sphere and mission. I'm quoting Ravenna. Since the Church reveals itself to be Catholic in the synaxis of the local church, this Catholicity must truly manifest itself in communion with the other churches which confess the same apostolic faith and share the same basic ecclesial structure, beginning with those close at hand, in virtue of their common responsibility for mission in that region which is theirs. Kamanchek explores the interrelationship between mission and communion when he takes up again the point of John Paul II about the special Christian experiences churches undergo, each in their context. Kamanchek wants to say that there are no Christian experiences that are not special in this sense, that is, that are not contextual, specific to a human and cultural milieu. Dr. Bouteneff was getting at this earlier this morning. He writes that when John Paul II spoke of the mutual inclusion of each local church with all the others, quote, the comparison is not between special Christian experiences and some unitary universal experience, but between the special experiences of one church and those of all the others. All of them attempts to be faithful locally to the demands that flow from the single and universal mystery of Christ. Budding writers wishing to learn the craft of fiction or autobiography are often told that the more rooted in particulars their narrative is, the more universal it is apt to be. And the same holds for the particular and the universal in the life of the church. There is no unitary experience of Christ in the world, only particular experiences by entering far enough into which the universal mystery may be seen. This calls to mind a remark that in another context might have been the dullest of cliches, but that to the mind and heart of a seminarian, such as I was, hit like a revelation, coming as it did from the lips of someone as profoundly formed by the church as the person who spoke it was. Be yourself, was all he said, at a moment when I badly needed to hear that. The corollary on the level of ecclesiology is expressed by Kamanchek when he speaks of the historical self-project of each church in its context, and writes of the missions in the plural, the missions in which the local churches realize themselves. And he elaborates, quote, it is indeed possible to speak of a single mission of the church, but the one mission is undertaken only within the specific missions of the particular churches. The realization of the specific mission in two different historical circumstances always involves a new, original, and unrepeatable experience, precisely because it is the encounter not between gospel or charism and mankind in general, but between gospel or charism and the concrete, particular, pre-existing subjectivity of these men and women here and now. The idea is for every church to be itself, not in isolation or opposition to others also being themselves, but in communion with them. A communion, however, which is not immediate, but requires continual and intentional exchange and mediation. While no local church can find its way to being itself apart from the others, neither can any of the others know for certain, not without taking great care and time to enter far into the particulars of its experiences, whether it is truly living up to its calling to be itself, to realize its historical self-project or not. In reading the pastoral letters of Archbishop Oscar Romero of El Salvador, one of the most striking things one sees is how often he didn't know what to do next. Saturated in the tradition of the church and in the social teachings of the Catholic magisterium through which he interpreted the world around him as it unfolded, he also found the unfolding of the real events around him to be the lens through which to understand his tradition's real meaning. None of this was possible without a spiritual struggle that demanded everything of him. Nor did he presume to undertake the struggle as though it were his alone and not that of the entire archdiocese, to whose members he constantly turned in consultation and in open admission of his lack of mastery over the bewildering circumstance they faced together. Romero had been strengthened incalculably by papal encyclicals, but it's noteworthy that the ecclesial choices made by Romero were misjudged, as today most observers would agree, by the man who during Romero's last years occupied the seat of the bishopric of Rome, and whose pointed observations about special Christian experiences and communion as mutual inclusion my paper has sought to highlight. It's well known that on Romero's last visit to the Vatican, he was sharply rebuffed by John Paul II, and only a little less well known that John Paul seems to have made up his mind to remove Romero as archbishop just prior to Romero's assassination in March 1980. Among many examples of how center of church unity in between the strictly local diocesan level and the universal level of the church played an indispensable role in the mission of the church in El Salvador, perhaps none was more dramatic in its impact than the single mass Romero called the entire archdiocese to attend at the cathedral in San Salvador, the Sunday after news had spread throughout the country of the killing of a well-known priest, Father Rutilio Grande, along with a young boy and an old man. Romero ordered all other masses throughout the archdiocese canceled, and the result was a mass celebrated by 150 priests and upwards of 100,000 people attending. In his book, A Gathering of Memories, Family, Nation, and Church in a Forgetful World, Charles Pinches notes that Archbishop Romero issued this order of the single mass in the face of the expressed opposition of the nuncio, the papal representative of the archdiocese. Pinches then observes, "We typically think of church as both local and universal, on either side of the middle space, generally occupied in our modern times by nation. In ordering the single mass, Romero stepped into this space, to the discomfort of both the papal representative and the national government. The effect of the move was to elevate the deaths of Father Grande, the young boy, and old man to the level of representation. The remembrance of their lives and murderous deaths was a way to tell and remember the people's sufferings, which had been going on for years throughout the country under the repressive governance and economic repression of the privileged few. In this dramatic move, Romero signaled to his people that he would not let that part of the story remain untold." Though in one sense it's merely to state the obvious, it's important for our topic to point out that the papal nuncio was not the archbishop. He didn't have the same relationship to those within the archdiocese that Romero had, didn't know them as Romero did, had not shared their sufferings and joys in the same way. The nuncio didn't and couldn't know the story as Romero knew it. Nations, writes Pinches, can neither control nor exclusively negotiate the stories that rise up within them. Indeed, they are required in many cases to ride along on the backs of these stories. What they ride on is nothing more nor less than a kind of memory, one relating to the things we've been speaking of throughout: land, birth and death, spilt blood, sacrifice. End quote. The story of a nation and the always particular, always new ways in which that story is continually transfigured by the gospel and the lives of those within it who love and serve God is a story that can only first be known from within. Of course, stories overlap and people move in and out of regions, and there's all kinds of cross-pollinating. Nations themselves rise and fall. Yet amidst the flux there remains enough continuity of place that its stories cannot be abstracted from it. Communion as mutual inclusion then becomes a matter of the mutual encounter of these stories, as they expand outward in concentric circles between regional groupings of churches, in order that the ecclesial choices of each may be tested by and harmonized with those of the others. And just as important, that God may simply be glorified when his Spirit is perceived to have been or to be at work in the other. The point is that there is always going to be a certain lag time, a process of reception. Another point is that if, as Pinchas suggests, the culture and political stories that determine how the mission of each local church or regional grouping of local churches is to be lived out rise up from within in ways that can't be controlled, then unity within the regional communion of churches is obviously of paramount importance for getting into focus just what the story is in terms of the gospel, as that story is emerging in all the crush and clamor of daily life. Without regional centers of unity, the churches of a given place will be badly compromised in their capacity to discern what is actually going on, where and how the gospel is being threatened, and where faithfully lived out, in order to be able to encourage and support one another. It's important here to acknowledge that in the ordinary course of events, Christians will themselves often enough get things wrong. St. Cyril called St. Chrysostom a heretic and an impostor. John Paul II was on the verge of sacking Romero. No amount of getting the structural balance right between or among the local, regional, and universal levels will bring about some total guarantee of perfect discernment. But it is worth noting that in the case of John Paul II, for example, his interpretation of Romero's activities in El Salvador was undoubtedly colored very much by the special experience he knew firsthand of the church under communist persecution in Eastern Europe. The story there was different from the story in Latin America. The same gospel was lived out differently in either place. Perhaps John Paul II was mistaking his own special experience for a unitary, universal experience of the Christian mystery. And concluding remarks. In view of the correlation between the political, social, cultural context and mission, we shouldn't be too quick to see the mapping of ecclesiastical administration on the pattern of civic society as mere worldly accommodation, whether in the 4th century with the rise of metropolitan provinces and patriarchates, or in the 19th with the rise of national autocephalous churches. Neither the specter of Gallicanism nor of Orthodox nationalism can be allowed to frighten contemporary ecclesiology away from facing up to the gross inadequacy of any notion of communion among particular churches that is severed from regional structures of ecclesiality. Ultimately, an ecclesiology without regional structures of authority is an atemporal ecclesiology tending toward docetism. The Ravenna statement offers rich reflection on this point, that a truly incarnational church must have regional organization. Quote, in fact, regional synodality, whatever its contours and canonical regulation, demonstrates that the Church of God is not a communion of persons or local churches cut off from their human roots. Because it is the community of salvation, and because this salvation is the restoration of creation, quoting Irenaeus, it embraces the human person in everything which binds him or her to human reality as created by God. The church is not just a collection of individuals, it is made up of communities with different cultures, histories, and social structures. The regional level of the church, end quote. The regional level of the church continually brings us back around to its temporality, and temporality is messy. The messiness of the stuff in the middle is striking. Provinces, patriarchates, autocephalous churches, episcopal conferences, and assemblies, all variously shaped bodies coming into being at some historical point and at another point losing their relevance to the actual socio-political reality. No doubt the very human messiness of this level and the comparative conceptual cleanness that's possible in discussing both the undifferentiated many dioceses at the local level and the one communion that is the universal church is what has led canonists to prefer a dyadic two-tiered ecclesiological structure in their understanding of the divine constitution of the church. In fact, with the three-tiered triadic approach that Ravenna and Catholic authors like Pottmeyer and Legrand prefer, one is sometimes left scratching one's head and asking, when you include the regional level, is it really even a triadic structure, or is it maybe quadratic, with the regional having to be subdivided into more than one level? But the constant and ubiquitous filling in of the intermediate sphere in the life of the church throughout history should tell us that it is no mere accident of history. Regional structures of communion allow the church to be what it is called to do and be the transfiguration of our world by the light of the gospel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Cohen. And I have the pleasure now to introduce Dr. Adam DeVille, Assistant Professor of Theology at the University of St. Francis in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Professor DeVille is editor of the trilingual international scholarly review Logos, a journal of Eastern Christian Studies. He is the author of Orthodoxy and the Roman Papacy and the forthcoming Sexual Differentiation and the Christian East, Sources Ancient and Modern, as well as over 100 articles and reviews in journals in Europe and North America. He is currently preparing a collection of scholarly articles on the encounter between Eastern Christianity and Islam, which Routledge Press is reviewing for publication. Professor DeVille's talk today is titled An Ecumenical Gift Exchange, Synodality and Primacy in the Search for Christian Unity.
Thank you. I want to begin with a thought experiment this afternoon. For Catholics in the audience, I would ask you to imagine that our last decade of scandals in this country, particularly concerning clerical sexual abuse and episcopal cover-up, conventionally dated to have started in the early part of 2002 in Boston. Imagine that series of scandals now going on a decade could have happened very differently, which is to say a lot less horrifically than it did if the structures of the Catholic Church in this country were different. And for the Orthodox in the audience, I want you to imagine, particularly members of the Orthodox Church of America, the OCA, I want you to imagine that your decade and more of scandals, particularly concerning missing monies under the former Chancellor and former Metropolitan, could have happened differently also, which is to say far more horrifically, had you not had the structures you do. The thing largely lacking in Catholic structures and largely present in Orthodox ones, and OCA structures included, are organs of synodality, or as they're sometimes called, structures of conciliarity or sobernicity. In what follows, I want first to talk in general about the importance of synodical structures, and then to argue that Catholics could benefit greatly by borrowing from the synodical model of the OCA. Now, before going on, let me make a couple of caveats and a couple of methodological comments. My first caveat is that nothing I'm going to say should be taken as a panacea. It is patently clear after but a moment's study of church history that no system, no set of ecclesial structures, ancient or modern, Eastern or Western, Catholic or Orthodox, is perfect. God alone is perfect. Flawed, fallible, fallen human beings in the church will always make mistakes. You can have the most wonderful structures in the world, but as long as their incumbents are fallen human beings, there will be problems. Nevertheless, as I hope to show, there are some structures that are better than others at preventing scandals and in dealing with them when they arise. My second caveat is that those familiar with the inner workings of both Catholic and Orthodox structures will tell you that appearances can sometimes be deceiving. La bella figura is not always so bella. It's not even much of a figura in some cases. In Orthodoxy, there can be, and certainly in history have been, instances of a centralizing, monarchical, quasi-papal control that have obscured or obliterated synodality, even while maintaining such names as permanent synod, holy synod, or synodal syndemusa. So there should be no romanticism here about Orthodox structures. But in the main, they are more synodical, and I think that is a very good thing. On the Catholic side, there are very few instances in the modern world of real synods. There are, however, two institutions that have vague resemblance to synods. That is the local Episcopal Conference and the periodic Roman synods of bishops. Neither is a real synod. Both are a good start towards real synods in the Latin Church today, but both crucially lack substantial legislative and administrative authority, and neither has electoral or juridical power. Absent such power, it is highly misleading to consider Western Episcopal conferences the equivalent of Eastern synods. So a couple of comments about how I will proceed. In what follows, I'm going to proceed according to a method you could give a variety of titles to. Open sobernicity, a phrase from Dumitru Stăniloae, which I recently learned from reading Father Radu's splendid book. If you have any interest in Eastern ecclesiology, you want to read that book. It's a fantastic work. Or an ecumenical gift exchange is the other phrase that a variety of authors have used, Margaret O'Gara, the Catholic historian of Vatican I, among others. My premise is that in matters of ecclesiology, and particularly ecclesiastical structures, both Catholics and Orthodox have much to both teach and learn from each other. I'm also going to be very practical in what I'm going to suggest this afternoon. And in doing that, I take my cue on the Catholic side from Pope Paul VI in 1964 in Ecclesiam Suam, when he wrote, quote, "The mystery of the Church is not a truth to be confined to the realms of speculative theology. It must be lived so that the faithful may have a kind of intuitive experience of it, even before they come to understand it." End quote. And even more clearly, on the Orthodox side, the historian John Meyendorff warned in 1980, on the eve of the first meeting of the International Orthodox Catholic Dialogue, quote, that in discussing issues of ecclesiology, the temptation is always great to manipulate concepts and doctrinal definitions while avoiding a critical approach to their application in practice. It is precisely that critical, practical application that I want to set before you today. And in doing so, I am motivated in part by the ressourcement movement that we have all benefited from over the course of the last century. And so in arguing, as I shall, for a recovery of a robust synodality in the Latin Church in this country today, I am not creating these arguments de novo or ex nihilo. I am, in fact, doing so following the counsel of such figures as Yves Congar, for example. In his great classic work, Vrai et fausse réforme dans l'Église, published in Paris in 1950 and only just now, recently, thanks to Liturgical Press, finally in English. And in there, what Congar called la grande loi d'un réformisme catholique, the great law of Catholic reform, he said, will consist by a return to the principles of Catholicism. It is necessary to interrogate the tradition, to re-immerse oneself in it. And if we do precisely that, we discover within the tradition of the Catholic Church an enormous history of local synodality, currently missing in much of the Roman Church today. I will not go into that history. I cover it in my book, Orthodoxy and the Roman Papacy. It's there in great detail if you want to read it. My point is that the history is there and we need to recover it, precisely for the good of the Church. And that's not just Congar's counsel. That is, as we'll see, the counsel of many other Catholics over the last number of years. So there's a long history of synodality, and that's well documented by very serious historians. Brian Daly of Notre Dame, for example, Thomas Noble, also of Notre Dame, Eamon Duffy and John Pollard of Cambridge, Michael Fahey, now of Boston College, I think is where he's retired to. So there's a long practice of synods meeting in the Church of Rome. More recently, there have been a long list of Catholics who have argued for a recovery of the practices of synodality. Again, I review them in detail in the book. Just to mention their names, among others, Timothy Cardinal Dolan, the current Archbishop of New York, John Quinn, the retired Archbishop of San Francisco, Patriarch Maximus IV, the Melkite Greek Catholic Patriarch of Antioch, the great Byzantine liturgical historian Robert Taft, and the late Ukrainian Catholic Metropolitan of Canada, Maxim Hermaniuk. These, among others, have all argued that the Catholic Church very much needs robustly synodal structures today. But the first person to set this whole discussion in motion, this whole trajectory, was none other than Joseph Ratzinger himself. In a series of articles, interviews, and books from 1964 down to 2002, Ratzinger decried what he called, quote, the extreme centralization of the Catholic Church. He went on to advocate for regional synodical governance by saying, quote, someday perhaps Asia and Africa should be made patriarchates distinct from the Latin Church, end quote. As recently as 2002, he frankly admitted that, quote, there is no doubt that we need such supra-regional associations, which then can take over some of the work from Rome, end quote. Now, since that interview in 2002, he's mitigated his views to some extent, but he's never retracted his larger argument in favor of the creation of patriarchal institutions in the Latin Church, notwithstanding the deletion of the title in 2006, which I've treated in a couple of articles and in my book. That was a very bizarre decision that I don't think the rationale for which was ever well articulated, as I've argued elsewhere. But I don't think to respond to the person this morning, I think it was Father Radu, that is necessarily a sign of increasing papal control. I tried to interpret it hopefully as Ratzinger saying he was going to start to implement what he'd argued since 1964. But we haven't seen that yet. It's been 6 years since that decision was made, and we've really seen nothing since, so we have to wait. So why am I talking about synods? What do they do? Why are they important? Why have them at all? There are, of course, many reasons, but there are two that I want to highlight. The first is theological, and the second is more practical or administrative. The theological rationale for synodality has, I think, been best articulated in several places by John Zazoulis, who argues that, quote, the synodal system is de sine qua non conditio for the Catholicity of the Church, end quote. In 2003, he went on to argue that synods without primates never existed in the Orthodox Church, and this indicates clearly that if synodality is an ecclesiological, that is dogmatic necessity, so must be primacy, end quote. So he goes on to argue then that synodality is the means by which we're able, in ecclesial structures, to give some manifestation to the balance in the church that is supposed to mirror the balance between the persons of the Trinity, between the oneness of the divine nature and the diversity of the divine persons. The second and more mundane rationale for synods comes precisely from their usefulness in the life of the church. Synods, broadly speaking, help ensure good governance by drawing on a wide range of people and giving them input. Broadly speaking, all extant synods in both Orthodox and Eastern Catholic churches have three responsibilities: election, coordination, and discipline. Each of these three, I argue, if lived today in the United States, in the Catholic Church here, would go some way towards cleaning up the Roman Church today and restoring some credibility to it and to its hierarchs. Each of these three, I think, would also be regarded by all Orthodox as welcome developments and clear signs that the Catholic Church is open to learning from Orthodox synodal structures and practices. A development that would go in itself some way towards alleviating Orthodox anxieties about the papacy. Anxieties captured in David Bentley Hart's memorable phrase that the papacy is merely the advance embassy of an omnivorous ecclesial empire. Election. The election of bishops. There is absolutely no convincing theological reason whatsoever that lay people and parish clergy should not be involved in episcopal elections. There is none. Now, the idea of lay people or even parish clergy voting for bishops causes, as I know from personal experience, some curialists to collapse on their fainting couch with a bad case of the vapors. But in so doing, they are simply estranged from their own much vaunted motto, "We think in centuries here." If the members of the Roman Curia did indeed think in centuries, they would know that many centuries ago, and for many centuries, the Roman bishop himself was not elected by an elite group of cardinals, but by a much wider body, not excluding lay people. Not always in the most edifying fashion, we have to admit, but nonetheless, they were involved. They would know also that lay and priestly involvement in episcopal election around the world has been the norm for almost all of history, both East and West, and remains today the norm for the 23 Eastern Catholic churches in communion with the Bishop of Rome. These 23 churches are typically structured synodically and enjoy powers of self-governance denied to Roman Catholics. Most Eastern Catholic bishops are elected by their brothers in a synod, not appointed by Rome, and are held to account by that synod and its head, the Patriarch. And so my question is, if regional and synodical governance is permitted and practiced by Roman Catholics, why is it denied to our by Eastern Catholics rather, why is it denied to our Roman brethren? And if you know the history, you know that this current Roman monopoly on episcopal appointments, as John Pollard and Eamon Duffy have made clear, and Peter Norton and Joseph O'Callaghan in this country, it's a singular practice less than a century old, coming in officially only with the 1917 Pio Benedictine Code of Canon Law. One should note that in all of the relevant documents and decrees of Roman councils and popes from Vatican I onward, treating both the papacy and the episcopacy, there is not one theological argument in favor of the Roman monopoly on episcopal appointments. There simply could not be such an argument. And so this monopoly has the appearance of being, in Duffy's memorable phrase, a coup d'église. The one who is to be head over all should be elected by all. No one should be made a bishop over the unwilling. That's a quote not from some addle-brained hothead in the 1960s, but no less a person than Pope Celestine I, in office from 422 to 432. Now, let's be clear, episcopal election doesn't guarantee any better bishops, as we all know. But it at least gives local people a say in the selection of their leaders. A say that is likely to produce better candidates than those who are supposedly vetted by an understaffed office thousands of miles away in Rome. And it also gives them a greater role in holding those bishops to account. And that, it seems to me, is precisely what made the last decade of sexual abuse scandals so very difficult for so many Catholics. The abuse in itself was horrific, but the cover-up and the lack of accountability by bishops, none of whom were deposed from office for incompetence or criminal collaboration, that was the real scandal for some. And so that brings us to the second point that synods often do, and that is discipline. Having elected a bishop, a synod can discipline him or depose him from office for serious offenses, including sexual abuse or covering the same up. And it is that lack of discipline, again, that I think has made some very, very upset and has caused a very sharp decline in the credibility of the Catholic Church in this country. Catholics have every right to expect that bishops will be disciplined firmly, effectively, and publicly, not, as a nuncio once suggested to me, by mobs demanding their heads on pikes, but by the fraternal correction of their brothers, seeking the repentance of sinners and their deposition from office where necessary. No less a person than the saintly Metropolitan Andrei Sheptytsky, head of my own Ukrainian Greco-Catholic Church from 1900 until his death in November 1944, said, quote, "The people are completely right to demand certain things from a bishop, and it is absolutely correct to censor him if he shirks the task that he has to perform on behalf of the Church and his people." End quote. And finally, coordination, responsibility of synods, consistent application of legislation on a variety of matters, liturgical, disciplinary, and so on. These are the three broad responsibilities of most synods. I go into further detail in my book about them. If you review synodal institutions and practices in the East, again, a lot of diversity there covered in my book, you will know that there's no one single model. There's great diversity of the structures that allows them to respond to their own particular contexts. So let me just turn very briefly to the structures of the Orthodox Church of America and suggest how those might be helpful models for the Catholic Church in this country to consider. There are four major bodies of authority in the OCA at the national level: the Synod of Bishops, the All-America Council, the Metropolitan Council, and the Metropolitan himself. Their particular responsibilities are detailed in the statutes, first established in 1971 and periodically revised since then. The statutes are not cast in stone. I am good friends with a former chancery official of the OCA, the Archpriest Andrew Yarmus. I had a long conversation with him last week and with Protodeacon Michael Myers, who's on the Metropolitan Council. They're both at the OCA parish in Fort Wayne. And they both stressed to me that these statutes are very much a work in progress. But you've got these four bodies that divide authority and treat different questions. The Synod of Bishops, described as the supreme canonical authority in the Church, the variety of particular responsibilities for election, coordination, diocesan boundaries, educational institutions, liturgy, iconography, and so on. The All-America Council, which is described in the statutes as the highest legislative and administrative authority within the Church. It meets every 3 years, consisting of all the bishops and priests and an equal number of lay delegates from parishes and other institutions. It has the right to pass legislation, but the Synod has the right to veto it. So there's a mutual check there. The Metropolitan himself, who is the president of both the Synod and the All-America Council. And then finally, the Metropolitan Council, which is the All-America Council in miniature, as it were. It meets between sessions of the triennial AAC to implement the work of the AAC and the ongoing daily administrative, legal, and financial life of the Church. It has control over the budget. So there is, in broad terms, in OCA structures, an attempt to balance the one and the many, and to ensure that no one single group or one single person is able to run roughshod over the rest of the Church. So let me conclude then very briefly, just to throw this out, to suggest what Catholic structures in this country might look like, could look like, if we were to borrow from the synodal practices of the OCA in particular, or of Orthodoxy in general. It is conceivable that the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops could be set up as a synod, the equivalent of the OCA's Holy Synod. All bishops meeting with legislative authority to decide comparable matters for the Church in this country, the election of bishops and their discipline, diocesan boundaries, liturgy, and so on. It is also conceivable that the All-America Council could be on the Catholic side, as Professor Wood said this morning, a provincial or a plenary council. There are historical examples of those, not recent. Such a council in this country might be logistically difficult to pull off, at least if we were to follow the OCA's delegated representational system, simply by virtue of size. There are so many more Catholics in this country than members of the OCA. But that's a practical matter that I think is not insurmountable by any means. The Metropolitan Council could have its equivalent on the Catholic side, again, as a body that meets between the larger provincial or plenary council to continue its work. And the OCA Metropolitan, I would argue, could in fact, on the Catholic side, have an American patriarch. There's no reason, there's already metropolitans in Latin structures in this country today. And I think following Ratzinger and others, whose argument I outlined in the book, there's no reason why we couldn't in fact have an American patriarchate set up with a synod and these other bodies that would act in liaison with other patriarchs around the world. So let me just conclude by noting that none of this is a panacea. I'm throwing this out as a proposal for people to think about. And I also want to stress that the beauty of the East is there's no one model that one has to slavishly copy. There are a diversity of structures to meet particularities of one's context. But Catholics can and should learn from Orthodox ecclesial structures and experiences of synodality, not only for potential internal Catholic benefits, but also as a way for Catholics to show Orthodox that we are indeed sister churches, with more than a passing resemblance to each other in structural form. This would, as I noted, go some way towards alleviating Orthodox anxieties about a centralized papacy. And it would also, I think, to return to our thought experiment at the outset, allow Catholics to proceed more confidently into the future, knowing that they, that is, laity and lower clergy, had a considerable say in reforming the Church and in holding their bishops to account far more than has happened during the last decade. But for that to happen, let me just say one final note towards the Orthodox. If the Catholic Church is going to find inspiration in Orthodox synodal experiences, then there are two problems on the Orthodox side that, as we've already heard, are going to require ongoing attention. One is the fragmentation, oftentimes into national churches, leading to what the late Ukrainian Orthodox Archbishop of Chicago, Vsevolod of Skopelos, has called intolerable chaos and a jurisdictional mess. To clean this mess up, the Episcopal Assemblies, as we've already heard, have been proposed, and I wish them every luck, every success. The same problem bedevils Orthodoxy on a global scale. Again, as we've also heard, the inability to call the Great and Holy Synod or Great and Holy Council, which has been bandied about since at least 1923 that I know of. And that has made, or could potentially make some Catholics at least a little leery about robust synodality, insofar as it might be taken as a handmaid to fragmentation and an emphasis on the local church at the expense of the universal church. In the end, then, I think both Catholicism and Orthodoxy need each other and need to learn from each other. Orthodox learning about the benefits of universal pastoral solicitude for all the churches, exercised by the Bishop of Rome, and Catholics learning about the importance of robustly synodal institutions at all levels of the Church. To the extent that we are able to engage in that mutual learning today, then this symposium will indeed have served us very well.
Thank you both so much. What wonderful presentations. I invite our speakers now, if they wish, to respond to each other's presentations with questions or comments. And after that, we turn the floor to the audience for questions that you may have for our speakers. Thank you so much for two wonderful papers. Let's see if these are turned on.
Should we go in?
Whatever you prefer.
Should I ask you? It's fresh in my mind. Well, I think we may have solve the problem of the Great and Holy Council, because Orthodox will only have to hear of the American Catholic Patriarchate coming along to immediately convoke a Great and Holy Council. Actually, I'm intrigued by this and think that even to be thinking along those lines opens up really interesting ecumenical possibilities. And one thing I wanted to ask in light of our conversation this morning about the jurisdictional sort of questions in North American Orthodoxy, and it may be asking you to draw too finely detailed a portrait of the American Catholic Patriarchate you kind of envision, but how would the Eastern Catholic structures sort of work within that, or do you have any thought on that?
Yeah, thank you. I had it initially and then took out for reasons of length a comment along those lines, because again, I find great inspiration in the OCA model with its so-called ethnic dioceses, which I think was an attempt to deal with precisely that question. Maybe not as successfully as was originally envisaged, but I think that was definitely a very noble attempt to try and come up with a solution to that problem. I think something similar could work within the Catholic experience. It already does work to some extent. There's a small Russian Catholic chapel in New York that I go to every time in the city. St. Michael's is on Mulberry Street, down in what remains of Little Italy in Manhattan. And it doesn't have, there's no Russian Catholic hierarchy in this country. It's under the Latin bishop. But it's perfectly able to function and sort of Byzantine Rite and do all those kind of things. So there are small precedents like that for that kind of thing. Historically, we know that hasn't always worked. Alexis Toth is a good example of that. But I think where the will is there, it's conceivable that something similar to the OCA structures could function. One of the things you said towards the end of your paper, I was really cheering, and I thought we need to hear this again and again and again. If I'm paraphrasing you correctly, that regional structures are not optional in history, and I think Catholics really need to hear that because whenever the Catholics have discussed regional bodies, patriarchates or metropolitans or synods or whatever, oftentimes the rejoinder from those of a very traditionalist bent is that, well, that really has no standing. That's not part of the divine constitution of the church. It's the local bishop and the bishop of Rome. Those are the two willed by God. The rest is all just, historical accretion that we can do away with, or we can tolerate. And so I think it's really important to stress that there's never been a time when we haven't had these, and they've always been really important. So I was really glad to hear that.
Yeah, I think this notion of taking up everything human, and that the human is not an isolated individual, but exists in community, in human community of all sorts, cultural, political. I do think, as I tried to bring out in the paper, that to suggest that because it's not unchangeable in its exact form, it's therefore dispensable, is really to risk a disembodied way and an atemporal way of being church.
Well, I'm sure that our presenters would welcome your questions or comments on their papers. And if you have questions, if you'd like to come up to the microphone so that we can all hear you well, that would be terrific. Anybody want to break the ice? Terrific, come on.
First of all, thank you for please give me an opportunity. This is directly aimed at Dr. DeMille out here. First of all, I really appreciate the clarification of myself as a Roman Catholic The clarification in regards of our scandal in the church, I really appreciate that, and I think that most Catholics are, when they really understand the circumstance and the situation, that they probably will appreciate this. There was basically something that has, I would say, bothered me, but concerned me for the last 10 years with my groups. You know, being able to continue to be a little bit forward in our faith, with of course this particular hindrance and obstacle that we have to overcome. And I think we're doing very well, and I hope, as being representatives and faithful towards our faith, you know, that we will overcome this with will of us, number one, and obviously, as we all know, everything is possible with God. But more so, I am furthermore a little bit more interested in the future of our church. And again, what I've heard here this morning and this afternoon, I really appreciate this. We learned a lot. But one thing I would like to be concerned with, and ask both of you the question here, is this. When we discovered a lot of things that you have discussed is way above my head. It is basically a little bit too fast for me. But what I understand out of this is that we, as Christians, what I consider both groups to be here, as being Christians, not too much today that we are focusing on our scriptures, the gospel. I have learned, being all over the world and trying to understand my faith, Christianity, is that we have multiple groups, theologians, experts, or whatever you want to call them, that basically sometimes, what I believe, creating more problems with interjecting some stuff that goes over a lot of people's head, but yet the majority of our church are basically all common people. How can you assess this and hopefully will clarify this for our church? Thank you.
I think if I understood, the heart of that question is about ways in which theological inquiry can go over the heads of people, and certainly I think that, you know, if you look back at the history of the church and the debate between homoousios and homoiousios, you know, it can seem pretty thorny, and yet we're indebted a great deal to those theologians who did that reflection, and there are key, you know, different trajectories ultimately in living that turn on some of those. So I do think sometimes the number of angels that stand on the head of a needle does matter. But at the same time, there is this question of, you know, being pastoral. And so I don't know, it seems that both have to go on. And, it, you know, maybe there are a variety of papers at this sort of conference. I worried mine was among the going over the head variety. But in any case, I do think, you know, the variety is important, different levels of inquiry.
I really appreciate the question. I was realizing coming in yesterday, the only other time I've been to Los Angeles was 1991, just to the airport. I was en route to Australia for the 7th Assembly of the World Council of Churches. I spent a decade working with the WCC, and what I realized then, and what I try to remember all the time, is that bodies like that, on that scale, operating at that level, or even smaller scale gatherings, are important, absolutely. They're, you know, as the philosophers say, they're necessary but not sufficient. In my own work, I think, deeply haunted by the failure of the Council of Ferrara-Florence in the 15th century. When you've got agreement among the hierarchs, and they take it home, and the people revolt. Some of them, anyway. And that's the last Council of Union between East and West. And so I've become more and more conscious over the course of the last couple of years that the intellectual work is of course necessary, but it's oftentimes at a very different level that union is going to happen, that unity is going to happen. I think, for example, that the late Pope John Paul II was very wise in insisting again and again and again, really from the first or second year of his pontificate all the way to the end, on what he called the healing of memories. Because I think for so many, that's where it's at when it comes to the search for union. Filioque, we don't even know what filioque is, right? Now, and babes see who gets to do what. What does that have to do with me? But I remember when your grandmother, her church in that little Orthodox village in the homeland, wherever that is, was burned down by a Catholic. You know? That's where ecumenism lies for a lot of people. And I try to always remind myself of that we need to be healing those memories, we need to be building those relationships on a very practical level. Getting to know one another, having coffee. I mean, the most mundane things, but they're important. And to be doing that alongside the academic stuff, the intellectual work, and never without the two. And so I was delighted when I sort of just this morning, in fact, realized the logic of our agenda. I think, if I'm not reading too much into it, we've got sort of more academic papers today, and then we've got pastoral and liturgical and musical reflections tomorrow, which is, I think, a wonderful combination. Precisely so that we don't become so top-heavy that we simply repeat Florence in the 21st century.
I think you both said that there are synods and there are synods. And so no one should make the mistake, and you both said this too, of thinking that having synods or even having national councils is a panacea or a cure-all. But one of the things that does set apart in the modern era this rediscovery of conciliarity is the Great Moscow Council of 1917 and 1918, which did the unheard of thing with both very progressive and very traditionalist members in that council, of saying that there was a place for everybody at these gatherings of the church, not just the hierarchs, the bishops, but also the clergy, the monastics, as well as lay representatives. And that has become, at least in many Orthodox circles, a very, very controversial matter, even claimed to be non-canonical. Our OCA structure, it should be known, is a direct appropriation of the Moscow Council reforms, which, by the way, were never implemented in Russia because of the revolution and subsequent developments. But in Japan, in the Diocese of Suroj in the UK, where Metropolitan Anthony Bloom was, in the Western Russian Orthodox Diocese in France and other countries, and in the OCA, they took these reform matters to heart, and they implemented them. And so we don't know any other way of electing bishops. We don't know any other way of approving budgets even. We don't know any other way of operating, even though there are people within our own OCA who say it should be the bishops and the bishops only, get rid of the Metro Council, get rid of the All-American Council, etc. It would be interesting to hear both of you comment on that, because it seems to me that's where the rubber hits the road. You said it very well, that this could put Curia officials into a tizzy. Well, not just them, but lots of other people too. I'd like to hear both of you talk about that.
I don't have a view, because it does occur to me that there is some traditional warrant for bishops having a particular charism of certain kinds of episcopal or conciliar activity. And the whole, we heard earlier the quotation of Tertullian that the church is in the bishop and the bishop is in the church. And the Ignatian, the kind of, I guess, Metropolitan Callistos where accuses Metropolitan John Zazoulis of monoepiscopomania in his focus on the Ignatian, St. Ignatius's focus on the bishop as the one locus of unity and the embodiment, in some sense, or the personification of the church. So, yeah, there's all this stuff back there that seems to suggest there is some reason for these traditionalists to wonder about that. It seems that the big issue that Adam was raising in his talk, and that I think this must have arisen out of, is just what are the various ways we can ensure openness, and that we're not self-enclosed and that we're not hiding out. And I don't know, I mean, do you then, I mean, does crossing those orders and all of that, does that get at it? Maybe, I don't know. Adam, what do you think?
No, I'm glad you raised that. When I was talking last week with Father Armis and Father Deacon Michael Myers, they'd mentioned that there's still an ongoing tension, and that they named some names of people, current and retired bishops, who've made that argument. Well, the bishops should decide it all. It's that simple. And you'll certainly find that on the Catholic side. I mean, I don't have the slightest hope that anything I've said today is going to be taken seriously by Catholics. I'm dreaming in Technicolor, or whatever that phrase is, because there's a long-standing fear there. I mean, as I said, to even suggest that bishops could be elected. I did that in print about 5 or 6 years ago now, because there was a debate when I was studying in Ottawa. There was a debate in the local paper. The Anglican Bishop of Ottawa and the Roman Catholic Bishop of Ottawa were retiring in the same month or even the same week of each other. And so I wrote a little op-ed for the paper in which I said, the Anglicans have an interesting system of election. Maybe Catholics could take a look at that and learn something from it. And the then nuncio to Canada, a figure who has absolutely no ecclesiological standing whatsoever, and he's the representative of the Vatican City-State to Her Majesty's Canadian government, that's it, gets on the phone with my bishop and says, rein this guy in for radical ideas. So there's a very strong current there of resistance to that, in this sense that, of course we shouldn't have lay people involved. Of course the bishops should be deciding all these matters. I don't see that changing anytime soon, as much as some of us might like it to. I think you raise an interesting point. You can cite precedents of fathers and others who would seem to support the sort of more traditional angle of things. I think there are all kinds of examples of churches where lay people have been involved, and some of that work has been done. But I think you've raised an interesting point that I hadn't thought of, that maybe some of the actual theological groundwork is not as neatly laid as it could be in order to help people get their heads around this. I think it's easy to instinctively reject it and be able to cite some sources to do that. It's harder for people. I think the Catholic Church has moved some direction. Lumen Gentium's discussion on the people of God, I think, has at least opened that up. But it's, the document's now 50 years old, and it's just now, I think, it's starting to awaken that kind of reflection on people.
And can I say one more quick thing? I mean, there's somewhere, Father Michael, you may know better than I, somewhere where Father Alexander Schmemann says, in this kind of, it's sort of this unfathomable thing because of what's going on around him, but he says, I believe in the bishops. Do you know where that is? Oh, you have.
I know where he says exactly the opposite of that. Okay. I think when he said that, he might have been being sarcastic.
No, not the one I'm referring to.
Well,
it was in spite of all. It was very sincere. In spite of all, he said, I believe in the bishops.
Well, he believed in the bishops, but if you know the history of his involvement with the Synod of Bishops, there was more than just belief. I mean, he actually, for the better part of 2 decades, sat with them in Synod as an advisor, and eventually was dismissed by them toward the end of his life, because they decided they didn't want any more advice. So when he says he believes in them, yes, he believes in them, but he also says that the structure of the church is conciliar. and that if you only have, you know, one part of the church standing out, making decisions, you don't have the conciliar shape.
I guess that's where theologically I wonder, is that quite right to say only one part of the church? That the bishop is one part, and then the priesthood is another part, and then the laity is another part. I don't know, again, I need to think about it more, but that seems different from saying one portion in one place and another portion in another place. So we're talking about something different ecclesiologically, but I don't know.
Your remarks brought some thoughts to mind. The Catholics and the Orthodox are both working in their own turfs to define what lay ministry looks like. The Catholics are looking at the lay ecclesial ministry, and even the Orthodox are trying to, in some circles, redefine what we as lay people can do in ministry. How do you see that relating to the conciliarity that both of you speak of on both the Catholic and the Orthodox sides? Does that make sense?
I think it does. I think it's an interesting question because the potential danger, I think, is always to assume that you know, lay ministry. How shall I put this? I guess the pitfall I'm very aware of is that of clericalism, and I think some people assume that, you know, until lay people can do everything that priests do, we're going to continue to have problems in the church. So I don't know how to draw those distinctions. You know, just as Father Michael was talking, I was thinking I have to go back and read Athanasius again, because in his book, The Church of the Holy Spirit, you know, very interesting way he sort of talks about the whole notion of laïque, that I think may be a helpful way to think through some of these questions. But as I say, it's not something I've really been able to straighten out in my own head.
Do you want to respond?
No.
Okay. Thank you. Yes?
I want to thank Professor DeVille for his very suggestive talk. This sort of thing has been suggested before. I guess my question is, how do you get it done? You know, there's certainly no, if you look at the history of the Catholic Church and the Roman Catholic Church in the second millennium, there's been an increasing centralization and localization of power in Rome at the expense of local churches. And power once taken is not given up easily, and that accounts for so much of the dysfunctionality, I think, in the church today. But I think there's another danger. You know, there has to be kind of a balance between conciliarity and primacy, and between local church and the primacy, and I didn't hear that in your talk. I mean, the other side for the Roman Catholic Church would be to kind of move in the direction of orthodoxy and then also in the direction of becoming a national church. And that has not worked well at all for orthodoxy. In fact, it seems to me it's one of the great traps for orthodoxy today, and in many ways paralyzes the Orthodox churches in coming together. So how do you articulate this kind of dynamic that allows some kind of leadership to Rome and to the primate, to the Bishop of Rome, and much more determination, self-determination in local churches? You know, there's another narrative, I think, of Avery Dulles in the last years of his life, talking about a global church needing a very strong centralized authority. And as you look at some of the tensions in the Asian churches and the Latin American churches lost much of their oomph after John Paul because they didn't have enough local power. Even the election of bishops, you know, I'm not sure if they were simply elected by synods. You know, should there be some role of the Bishop of Rome to keep that kind of balance or tension? The Jesuits have a nice system. When we need a new provincial, we send a turner to Rome, and then the general chooses 3, or he can reject them. And, you know, if he doesn't choose one of the first 2, the turner goes back. And maybe that would be a good way to give some kind of input from the Bishop of Rome and very clear input from the local church, whether it's the synod and the clergy and laity working together with the synod of bishops. But there's a need to articulate those structures, I think, so that they're held in the right kind of tension. And I'd like you to say a few things about that.
Yeah, thank you. I didn't, really good questions. I didn't talk too much about primacy today, only because I felt like I've treated it in a lot of detail in my book. And so I wasn't gonna duplicate that, but you've highlighted some really important issues. And precisely what I tried to do in the book was that tension. Because I don't want, there is no point in simply mindlessly replicating the problems that the East has in order to make the Roman Church resemble it. There is room to go towards greater synodality, but also important room for primacy. And Zazoulis, I think, has articulated that very well. You cannot have one without the other. I mean, he just says that again and again and again. Primacy has to be linked to synodality. Synodality has to have a primate. The two simply always go hand in hand. How that gets worked out in particular ways, I think, there's room for maneuver there. I was at a conference at the Orientale Lumen Conference in Washington last summer, and I had a long and very profitable exchange with Monsignor Michael McGee. He's a Roman Catholic ecclesiologist. His doctoral dissertation was on patriarchates within the Catholic Church. And he reminded me, he said, if there is this diversity in the East, then it should be able to allow for the Latin Church to maintain a very strong centralized primacy, if that's what it wants. That's part of its charism, that's part of its history. But it needs to be a very conscious decision, not something that's just kind of happened that way or power has gradually sort of accrued to the center. I mean, if you read a lot of Catholic ecclesiologists, Pottmeyer being a clear example, Jean-Marie Thiard being another, they've all made it very clear that current Vatican structures and governance cannot look to Vatican I or Vatican II for justification. So you have to look somewhere else. And it is, as you rightly suggest, the issue of power, and that's the devil in the details. Once given, it's very hard to take back. But I think it can be done. The question becomes: is there the will to do it? I mean, I have this among some Eastern Catholic colleagues. We have this discussion every couple of years, and I say, look, why don't we just say no? What are they going to do? Excommunicate us? Well, that's great. We want unity with the East, but we're going to cut the Ukrainian Catholics off because they, ordain married men, or something. If people have the will, I think they can say, look, this does not, by right, belong to the center. That's not to say you want to gut the center, you want to gut Rome. No, I think I wrote an article a number of years ago on how Catholics could elect their own bishops while allowing Rome a say in that process. And there's a variety of ways you could set that up. And I think that's important. In fact, in the article, as I recall, I said, there are some churches that are too young to have that responsibility at this point. But for well-established local churches where there's no danger of political manipulation, they should be entrusted with the responsibility. If there's going to be a new version of the investiture crisis from the 11th and 12th centuries, then you probably don't want to go down this road right now. But if you've got a well-established local church that's able to function without political or government interference, why can't they be trusted with the responsibility for election and allow Rome to have a say? Rome would have a stronger say in places where the church isn't capable yet of that kind of election. So there are ways of balancing these things, and I think the balance is really important. A decentralized, extremely decentralized system will only, I think, replicate the problems we've already seen in the East. And an extremely centralized system, well, I think we're familiar with the problems of that. It's one of the great ironies, it's one of the great paradoxes. I'm often accused of wanting to revolutionize the church, weaken the church by talking about people electing bishops, for example. I say, look at what we've had. We've had this incredibly strongly centralized system, and what's it given us? So you're telling me that this is the answer? I mean, the logic just fails as far as I'm concerned. So no, I'm not saying we go all the way in the other direction, that's going to solve all the problems, but don't tell me that keeping what we've got, or making it even more centralized, is somehow going to be the solution. I mean, I simply don't find that argument remotely plausible. So it is, I think it requires that kind of ongoing back and forth. And, you know, I was, again, when the All-American Council met in November in Seattle for the Orthodox Church, I was listening to it on Ancient Faith Radio for much of it, and a lot of it was very tedious. You know, back and forth about how much assessment we're going to levy against each diocese to send to the central administration and so on. But I wrote to some friends of mine, including the new chancellor, and I said, you know, normally this is the kind of stuff that, you know, cures insomnia, it doesn't cause it. But I stayed up late listening to it because they were having this discussion and being open about these things. What I took away from it was, we're struggling to find ways to make this work in our own context. And I think that's true of all ecclesiological reflection. It's a messy work in progress. And we'll make some balances. Okay, we go this far, we discover, well, this doesn't quite work. We've become too decentralized, and we need to pull back and give more authority to the center. Or we've got way too much authority to the center, we need to give it out to the regions. And make those adjustments periodically if we are, in fact, a living body. And you know, not freeze things in time.
Professor Cohen, did you care to respond?
I don't think I can add a lot to that at this point. Thanks.
Further questions? We still have a few minutes. Then perhaps I'll ask Professor Cohen a question. Oh, please.
This is a question for Professor DeVille. You referred to the financial scandal of the OCA, and I wonder if you've evaluated the influence of OCAnews.org on what some Orthodox thought was a rather turgid sabor at the time, and what you think will be the effect on sovereignty of the OCA since the OCAnews.org has closed. That is, what role did it play? Would there have been a resolution of the financial problems without OCA News? In other words, what do you think the internet is going to do to the church?
Right. It's an important question. I think the internet could potentially be very useful, precisely as I argue in the book, for synodality. You know, one of the concerns, if you have ongoing permanent synods, you take bishops away from their dioceses and administration. And I've said, well, you know, in the era of video conferencing and Skype and everything else, is it not possible to have synods, at least one synod, occasionally, via electronic means? I think most people will concede that OCAnews.org was really instrumental in bringing a lot of that to the light. And I think some evidence of that is in the efforts of some bishops to shut it down and discredit the writers on there. So I think it played a role. And I think it was a helpful example of people taking responsibility and putting stuff out there. When I was talking to my friends in Fort Wayne in the OCA, particularly Michael Myers, who's on the Metropolitan Council, he really felt that the scandal was helpful in forcing the Metropolitan Council to really sort of, you know, to use your phrase, to be itself for the first time in its history, to sort of stand up and say, we have this role, let's do it. Let's stop overly deferring to the synod of bishops, and let's play the part that the statutes have given us to play, as difficult as that might be. So I think it was a helpful tool in prodding things along. There was one other thing I was going to mention that I've forgotten.
Further questions? Yes, please.
Hey, I'm from the Coptic Orthodox Church, and I'm glad that it was mentioned in the morning, the dialogue between the two families of Orthodox churches, the Byzantine and Russian, and the Orthodox Church of America on one side, and the Oriental Orthodox, which is represented by the Copts, the Armenian, and the Syriac, and Ethiopian, and etc., Indian. So since this session is entitled Open Doors, Open Dialogue, and also we're talking about why ecclesial structures at regional level matters, I have a piece of good news, and of course, I would be grateful for your response. When the conversation between the two families of Orthodox churches, they made almost complete agreement, mutual agreement, but they couldn't come to the point of actualizing it in real life. So you cannot say it broke, it didn't break, it actually achieved the monumental historical level, but it was not able to actualize it. Except for the two patriarchs in Alexandria, the Coptic Orthodox Patriarch and the Greek Orthodox Patriarch of Alexandria. They made a historical agreement that I wish they did 15 centuries ago, which was to have mutual pastoral and Eucharistic acknowledgement and sacramental, especially to help mixed marriages between the two churches. If you are not familiar with this, in Egypt and almost all Islamic countries, if two people marry but they belong to different denomination, Islamic law applies, not they're separate. So if a Greek Orthodox marries a Coptic Orthodox and they have a problem, divorce, etc., Islamic law applies, and there is a whole host of problems occur, including, custody of children, etc. There's so many problems. So the two patriarchs allowed mixed marriages to go one Sunday to a Greek church, receive communion, baptism, everything, and the next Sunday they can go to a Coptic church, the whole family, to receive communion, participate in the whole life of the church. And so this is a historical event that applies to all what we have been talking about this today. And sorry, I spoke too much, but would be interested in your response and the reflection on this, if you see it indeed a historical event.
Yes, what you're describing puts me in mind of the Zogby proposal in the Middle East, which was a proposal for double communion that I believe it was Melkite Church would be both in communion with Rome and with the Orthodox East, and this didn't get traction. I think it comes back to the issue that was discussed some this morning in Dr. Wood's presentation and elsewhere about reception. What are the mechanisms for such things to be received throughout the Orthodox churches, and how is there a binding decision on that? So there's a certain kind of something approaching paralysis on issues of that nature. I do think there was one other problem in the 1990 Second Agreed Statement between the Eastern Orthodox and the Oriental Orthodox, which had more to do with the Oriental Orthodox side, which is that the Eastern Orthodox participants in that dialogue, the issue was whether it would be possible to affirm, as the non-Chalcedonian or pre-Chalcedonian churches do, this single will of or single nature of Christ in both a human and a divine aspect. And the Eastern Orthodox saw the Oriental Orthodox formulation as okay. The Oriental Orthodox were more hesitant to affirm the Eastern Orthodox formulation at Chalcedon. And I think that had to do with a lot of political issues. The fact that the Eastern or the Oriental Orthodox had been sort of beaten up historically by the imperial, Byzantium. So there was more of a fear, maybe analogous to Orthodoxy's relationship to Roman Catholicism. But in any case, the smaller player there, politically speaking, I think was fearful of being affirming of the bigger. And until both can affirm the other, in the same degree, at least there's a complexity there that I think was a sticking point. I don't know if that makes sense.
Well, thank you so much. I'm sure you all would join me in thanking both our presenters for such thoughtful and thoughtful.
This brings us to the end of today's content sessions, but today is not over. Before I announce the next part of today's festivities, I'd like to remind you all that we will be continuing the content portion of our symposium tomorrow. If you look in your program, you can see all the details. Tomorrow is, for all practical purposes, part 2, beginning at 9:30 with breakfast, morning prayer in the Catholic tradition at 10:10, and then 3 sessions on liturgical music, the situation of the parish, and social justice. So I invite you all back tomorrow, and lunch is included, so come back. Free food is always good. And in that vein, with thanks to all of the presenters and to all of you for being with us today, we will now have a festive reception to which you are all invited. And again, that's outside in the atrium area, and if anyone has any questions in that location, they can ask. So thank you again, and we hope this